Hey, what's up guys? Chip Walters here, and today I want to talk about creating your own startup file in Blender. Now you may be asking yourself, why don't I just post a startup file? And the reason why I don't is because Blender changes and sometimes startup files become incompatible. And if I show you how and why I create my startup file and the settings involved, you'll be able to recreate it or modify it at any time in the future. So let's get started. Okay, so here we are in the default open screen of Blender, and I leave these defaults as they are, hit the next button, and then I'm ready to go. First thing I do is hit the A button to select everything, hit the X button to delete everything. I'm going to rename this collection to Gaffer. I'm going to click over here to create a new collection, and I'm going to call this Basic Scene. And with Basic Scene selected, I'll hit Shift A, and let's go ahead and add a plane. Let's scale it up, and then let's not forget to apply our scale, so that now if we look over here, we'll see that our scale is all set to 1. Next, I'm going to do Shift A and add another plane, and this time I'll tab into it, and I'll hit the 3 key, which is going to basically give me the ability to select the polygon, hit the E, Z, extrude it up, and I will go 2 units. So next, I'm going to go in here with this perfect cube, and I'm going to add a modifier to it. Let's add a bevel, and then let's add one more modifier. Let's add a second bevel, and we'll make the width just very small, something like that. And I'll right click on this, say shade smooth, go down here in my vertex panel and make sure that in my normals I auto smooth it. And there we have the geometry for our basic scene. Now let's go into the gaffer, and we'll Shift A and add a camera. If I hold down the Control Alt and I hit the Q button, I will go into 4 view, and this will help me. Also, if I hit the Z button, and I'll go back into wireframe mode, and there we can see our camera. So let's select our camera and let's move it out so that it's top view. And I can just basically just hit the G key in any one of these views. I can also hit the R key to rotate it around. If I go over here, I can say Command Shift 0, and that's going to show us what we have in our camera view. So that looks pretty good. So I'll come back, Control Alt Q again, and hit the 0 key to get out of the camera mode, and that's our camera right there. Now that we have our camera set, now all we need to do is add our lighting. So for that, let's go ahead and add lighting with Shift A, one area light, and Shift A and add another area light. So let's rename these area lights. So the first one we'll call area dash main, and the second one we'll call area dash fill. We'll go back over here and Control Alt Q to get back here, and let's go ahead and Z, and let's grab these lights. Here we go. Over here, R, rotate, rotate. Click over here, R, rotate, and R rotates. So now we'll actually go into this tab for each one of the lights, and let's set the power to 500 watts for each one. There we have our lit scene. In the fill, I always like to add just a tiny little bit of blue, not a lot, but just enough to kind of give it this blue kind of shadow area, which makes for nice rendering. So at this stage, let's go ahead and save this file. I'll go over here and say Save As, click on Volumes. I have this folder called Startup. I'll sort it by date, grab the last one, hit the plus button here to increase it by 1 to 21 instead of 20, and we'll save the Blender file. I'll also, at this point, go into my favorites, and I'm going to add a bookmark to some of the places where I know I'm going to come back. So I'll hit the plus button, and it just put my blend files here. Okay, so let's jump into preferences real quick and take a look at what we have here. So let's go first into the interface. Nothing changes here. Themes, nothing changes. Viewport, we want to basically add multi-sampling here because we have an NVIDIA card. I'm going to just hit the 8 button here for that. Lights, I can actually add LookDev HDRIs here. Click this button to install them. Editing, let's leave this alone, as well as animation. Add-ons, we'll take a look at the add-ons, and these are the add-ons that actually ship with Blender. There are a couple we want to basically enable. Let's just go down and turn on this one, 3D View Modifier Tools. That's going to give us our panel over here. Our import-export will be automatically selected for us. Scroll all the way down to Node Wrangler. We're going to turn that one on. Object Bool Tool, we may use that. and I use Obscurant Tools, which will allows me to align objects with each other. Okay, we're going to skip input. This all looks fine, and we'll go to navigation. And in navigation, we're basically going to swap these. We want the orbit around the selection and auto perspective. And what that does is when we select something, we orbit around the thing that we select. Skip key map, and now we're in the system tab, and I have some NVIDIA cards. These are already selected automatically and turned on, but you want to make sure that's the case. I'm going to jack my undo steps up to something like 64. You can go higher if you want. Save and load, we leave that the way it is. And file path, we can set our file path for fonts and textures and everything like that. Then we just go right into here and we say save current state. Now I know that we have this set to auto save preferences, but I do that anyway at this point. So now I'm done with this and I can close it. So lastly, I've gone ahead and installed KitOps and Power Snapping Pies. I went over how to install snapping pies in a previous video, and there's a lot of videos that I have that tells you how to install the free version or the pro version of KitOps. I'm gonna come back over here, Control Q to get into this render menu. I'll turn on rendering. What I want to do now is I want to set up my scene so that it works the way I want to. So first off, let's go ahead and texture these objects. And in my case, I'll use KitOps. I'll use our material pack, and I'm going to go into the metal. I'm going to choose steel, and if I hold the control key down and add it, I've got steel on here, so you can see that's what that looks like. Then I will click over here. I'm going to add another material. Let's add some concrete, and I'll go to this concrete plane and hold the control key down and add that. So I've got the concrete and the material. Now you notice it's really very bright, and that's because we have not yet set up our world. Okay, to set up the world, we need to get into the shader editor, and I'm going to just drag this up a little bit, go over here, get into the shader editor, go over object and say world. And here is our world. We have a world output and we have a background. The background is a gray color. So I'm going to first off, I'm going to make the strength of this 0.2. So that makes it a little bit darker. Now we're going to need to add a little more lighting to it. And what I want to do is I want to use an HDRI to add lighting. So to do that, I want to basically use this background as our background. I want to use an HDRI to help light the scene. So let's add some nodes. Shift A, or I can go over here and say add search, and we'll add a environment texture. We're going to add a free HDRI map, and I will include it in the files for this project. I'm going to grab this multi-area light, say open image. Next I'll take this background and I'll do Shift D to duplicate it. I'll make a strength 0.3, and I'll hook up this now to here. And if we hook this up to the surface, you'll see that we have now this being lit by this HDRI. But the problem is we don't want all this stuff in the background. So how do we fix that? Pretty simple. We're going to basically use a couple more nodes. The first is a mix shader, and I'll put that in here, and then I'll hook this one to the bottom set of that. And you can see as I move this, it switches between the two. But what I want is this FAC. I want this to be a function of a light path node. So let's add that. There's a light path, and let's put it over here. What we'll do is we're going to say is camera ray, and we'll put this into the FAQ. And now you can see we have the background is dark, yet we're using the HDRI to light the scene. So that's how we set up our world. Okay, I'm going to switch this back to object, and I'm going to leave it down here. And I typically work this way, so I'll leave this kind of minimized down here. One of the things that I want to do when I'm setting up the lighting for this scene is I want to actually go into the look dev and try and match at least the brilliance of it. You'll see that we're not that far off in terms of look. It's a little bit darker. We can always go in and adjust the HDRIs if we need to, but I kind of like the way this is looking. Let's go ahead and save this now, and let's continue. So one of the things I don't like is I don't like this grid up here under the grid, and let's just turn off the floor. So now I don't have the floor, and I want that as a default, just to leave that off. The other thing is that when I select something, I want to see a gizmo, and the way I like to set this up is that I like to stay in this arrow key over here, the select box. And to set this up properly, you go to Object Gizmos and you go to this default one and you want Move and Scale. Rotate. If you put Rotate in there, you're always clicking on it, so you don't want that in there. So let's go back and turn off the Rotate. So this means that anything that you click on, you can move or scale around. Now, sometimes you may find this is getting in the way, and if you hold the Control tilde key, you'll see that it hides it. So Control tilde toggles the display of that on and off. Another thing I like to do in the solid mode is turn on the cavity, and I particularly like it with just world set. I'll get a little bit of ambient occlusion when I do that. You can see it down here. You can do both, but it does kind of create some weird things on the edges. You see these become highlighted, so to speak, and makes it a little bit more difficult. Some people prefer it, I don't. So I always keep it to just the world, which is just very subtle. Okay, now let's talk about the settings for Eevee. So we'll click over here, and we're in Eevee rendering mode. First off is I want the viewport, since I have a powerful computer, I want this to run at 128 and the render to run at 128 as well. So that works really good for me. I turn on ambient occlusion, I leave bloom off, I turn on screen space reflections, and then I want to make sure I click on refraction as well. I go to shadows, and instead of ESM, I'm going to use VSM, and the VSM works better for interiors. And I'm going to set this cube size to 1024 for the shadows, and I want them to be high bit depth as well. Go to indirect lighting, and the only thing I change here is the cube map size to 1024. Turn that off, and I'll go to film, and I'll check the overscan box. This allows me to render reflections that aren't seen on screen. Go down to color management, the look, and I'm going to set this to medium high contrast. And that's it for Eevee. Now I'm going to go over to this one, which is the scene setting. Key thing that I want to make sure that I do is set this to be a JPEG, so that I render out JPEGs and not pings. So next, let's set up our Q menu. Our Q menu is when you press the Q key, you'll see something come up over here. Right now we don't have anything, no menu items found. So the first thing I want to do is I want to be able to toggle this on and off. So with it on, I'm going to right click and I'm going to say add to quick favorites. Now I want to go over to Q menu. You can see I can toggle the overlays on and off. Next, what I want to do is I want to actually be able to display wireframes, and this is important for the NITROX3D workflow. So I'm going to go over here, and where it says wireframe right here on the checkbox, I'm going to right click, add to quick favorites. If I go back over here and I hit the Q key, I can show the wireframe for the objects in the scene. Toggles it on and off. Remember that grid floor that we had? Let's go ahead and add that one next. On floor, right click, add to quick favorites, come over here, Q. Now we can display the grid floor or turn it on and off. We'll leave it off for now. Next, let's go ahead and add the face orientation rendering mode. So I'll go over here, and with face orientation, right click, add to quick favorites, go into solids mode, hit the Q. Face orientation shows you whether or not faces are flipped or properly oriented. Next, let's talk about being able to copy materials one to the other. So the way I like to do this is I'll click over here in my materials setting, shift click these two so that this becomes enabled. So this means that if we were to copy the material, it would copy this material that's the primary selected to the secondary selected. And if you looked over here, you say copy material to selected, and we can right click on that and add to quick favorites. So now if I select here and here, Q, copy material selected, effectively copies the material to the selected object or objects. And lastly, another one that I like to do, and let's just make an example here, Shift A, let's make a cube, move it up, move it over here. Okay, so I'm going to right click on this cube and say shade smooth, and you get this kind of funky thing going on. And typically you got to go all the way in here and you go to normals and you hit this auto smooth. So if I right click on here, add to quick favorites, now I can come over here and I can hit this Q button and just say auto smooth, and it fixes that for us. I will add other shortcuts depending on what I'm doing. Sometimes I'll add the Baker radiance maps or clear caching or some of those things. So those are the Q menu shortcuts that I like to use for object mode. So let's go now and let's go into edit mode. And so in edit mode, there are a number of different shortcuts I like to set up. The first one I like to do is remove double vertices. And they used to have an actual command that was called that, but it's been renamed. So I'm going to come in here with the edit mode, select everything, go into vertex, merge vertices, and go by distance. And that's how this works, is you can set a distance like this. Again, we'll go back under the vertex, merge vertices by distance, right click on it, and add to quick favorites. Now if I do Q, we have by distance, which is now the same thing as remove double vertices. The next one is I want to be able to flip normals. So I'm going to go into 3 mode. I'm going to select a face. I'll go into mesh over here and I'll scroll down to normals and I'll right click on flip and add it to quick favorites. So now if I go back into this object and hit the Q key and I say flip it and then I tab out of it, we'll see that we have a flip normal, which does kind of some funky things. So let's undo that. Next, I'm going to do one called select boundary loop, which is really handy. I'll select 2 faces. I can go under select and select loops and select boundary loop. I'm going to right click, add that to favorites, and then I'll come over here and Q, select boundary loop, and notice it selected just the outside. It didn't get this, and that's really handy for a lot of different things that you may want to be doing. And lastly, I also like to use the symmetrize feature quite a bit, and so I'm going to go in here and select this and go into my mesh and symmetrize, add to quick favorites. So if I were to take a point and move it out, for instance, and then select everything and then Q symmetrize, you'll see that it moves it out in the other place. So let's undo that, undo that, undo that. Tab out of there. So that's the Q shortcuts for edit mode. There's one other shortcut that I like to use, and it's not a Q shortcut because it doesn't map to the Q menu. What it does is it basically turns the object representation, the visibility in the viewport, to either wireframe or bounding or others. So let's go ahead and look at that. I'm going to go in here to this object property, viewport display, and you can see that here we have wire, solid, bounds, all of these different things. So the way I need to set this up is I need to right click on it, and you'll notice that there are no Q buttons here, but there is an assigned shortcut. So I'll hold that down, and I'm using the Alt+1 for that. So now when I'm over here and I hit Alt+1, nothing happens. As soon as I move over here, I can set this up. Doesn't matter what panel I'm in. And this is good when you're creating Booleans manually and you want to basically turn off the cutter object. This is one of the things that works really well. So lastly, what we need to do is we need to set this scene up exactly as we want it to appear when we launch our startup file. And I'm going to do this way. I think I'll set up with the dimensions here, this item here. It's always going to start in this mode anyway. Let's close this off. Let's basically delete that hierarchy. Let's create a new collection, and I'll call this stuff, and I'll keep it highlighted so anything I now create will end up in stuff. And once I've got all that set, I just go under here and say File, Defaults, Save Startup File, and then I also want to save this as well. So now when I close this file, I relaunch it, you'll see it comes up with the proper aspect ratio, with my scene, this selected, and I like that selected because I can just go in here and delete if I want, and I'm ready to go. So even though I'm ready to go, let's go ahead and render this in Eevee mode, and you'll see that I have these purple items, and that means that I'm missing textures. And the reason for that is that I did not embed these textures in the scene. So if I go in and open that startup file, and I go ahead and say external data automatically pack, and then say save, and then say save startup file, and now I will quit and I will launch it again, And we see that when we render it, we have all of our textures in the right place. So that's something to keep in mind. This is a very basic startup file, but you can customize it. I think I've shown you all the different ways that you can customize it, and I hope this helped you get started. See you online.